Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the nice words and for putting this together. I think it's really a great idea to put minds from different disciplines together to work on common problems. And from my perspective, actually, I view understanding of how the brain works or computes as a pretty wide open question. Then I don't feel that we have understood 80% and we just have to figure out some details. I think we are possibly missing really the main concepts and mechanisms there. And so therefore I think one can see this positively. You all can play a big role then in really discovering what is really important about brain computation and learning. So I want to focus on three questions. How can networks of neurons in the brain represent probability distributions? It's a somewhat unusual question. How can the brain extract knowledge from such distributions? And which distributions could possibly be represented in the brain? And I want to start with one of my first lessons when I came from mathematics and computer science to colleagues from experimental neuroscience. They told me that actually the brain is completely different from a computer, because if you give to an animal 5 times the same visual stimulus and you record from number of neurons, here 8 neurons, then you see from trial to trial it looks quite different, right? It's very hard to see any pattern there. One can use machine learning pattern recognition methods to figure out actually what the stimulus was then, but if you simply look at it, you don't see any kind of reliable response patterns there. And so this occurs apparently in virtually every experiment in neuroscience, every spatial and temporal scale, including large scale fMRI. One other surprising feature is when you talk to synapse physiologists, neurophysiologists, you find out it's really crappy wetware in a sense, considered from the perspective of computer science. Because some in the synapse, which is something extremely important right now, we assume most of our memory of our identity is really encoded in the synapses. But what happens when a spike arrives at the presynaptic bouton? Then one guesses that perhaps only with a probability of 10%, actually something happens postsynaptically. So with 90% probability, nothing happens. It's really a failed communication attempt then. This looks really strange then. And there are many additional sources of noise in neurons, which one now discovers also when there are new experimental methods which allow you to understand events within a thin dendrite. So there is an unreliable initiation of dendritic spikes. And there are many other stochastic processes which are already well known, like stochastic channel openings and closings there. And finally, one other puzzle also, which I found intriguing, is that you can do the experiments yourself. Then if you look at one of these images for a while, then although the image in front of your eyes doesn't change, after a while your percept changes, and it keeps flipping forth and back then. And Legotetis lab has also studied this with electrode recordings from monkey. And they find that when the percept changes, which the monkey signals then also the brain states really changes. And lots of firing rates of many neurons all over the brain, particularly in higher brain areas, really change then, although the stimulus doesn't change. So this is also something which, for example, I wouldn't like to have in my laptop to happen then. And I think for theoretical neuroscience or computational neuroscience, the question is whether these types of puzzles are really consistent with our favorite models of neural computation. You're all familiar with these ideas. They are now several decades old. And one of the nicest old model is the one of a tractor neural network. So one thinks when you have a computation, you start with the input or cue, you see something, you start out somewhere here in the high-dimensional state space of the brain, and then you move into the next attractor. Or if you start here with the input, then you move into this attractor. And this is often viewed as a paradigm for brain computation. But one immediately sees that with this computational model, one gets in trouble with some of these effects. For example, how can you then switch forth and back between two attractors, as in this previous experimental results? And for example, how can you produce several memory items for a cue? So how, when you have moved to one memory item maybe, how can you then hop to other memory items which have something in common? And how can you use one recalled memory item, so meaning you have landed here in the attractor, to then recall similar items? For example, what happens afterwards then? So one sees that these nice and elegant mathematical models for neural computation are inconsistent with quite a number of these results then. And then colleagues in cognitive science, the group of Josh Tenenbaum and Tom Griffith at Berkeley, argue that there are also behavioral reasons, more serious studies, and they argue that one should really view the knowledge base of the brain as a probability distribution there. And they mainly think in terms of a prior distribution, and which then is activated when you guess something. I don't want to go into these details of these studies. Quickly want to mention also more recent result from neuroscience, which is still not debated. The result is in principle quite easy to understand. So they're recorded with 16 electrodes from a V1 primary visual cortex of ferrets. So the time goes in this direction, and so this is a time bin of 2 milliseconds. And then for the sake of this analysis, they simply kind of replaced the spike events during this 2 milliseconds by simply a sequence of zeros and ones, simply recorded which neuron spiked during this time bin then. So in this way, you have this sequence of bit strings then, and you can now, for any particular behavioral situation, can simply look at the distribution of these states of these 16 electrodes or 16 neurons, say. And they compared the statistics of these states of these neurons with two different situations. One when the animals looked just at a dark screen, it was just spontaneous activity. Another one while they watched movies then. And the main result is that the distance between these two distributions there became smaller and smaller while the animals developed. And so this is now age 129 when they're adult animals, and it's a relatively small distance between these two distributions measured in the Kullback-Leibler divergence there. And they argued then in the paper this means that this distribution of network states also during spontaneous activity can be viewed as really a fingerprint of an internal model for the visual environment, which is then inside the brain also if you don't receive visual stimulus, if you don't watch movies. So both of these types of results, this one and the ones from cognitive science, are still debated. So I think one should not view them as a last word, but it's an interesting start in a new direction. And for theoretical neuroscience, the challenge arises from these types of results that we also should provide theoretical ideas and guidance how realistic models for networks of neurons in the brain could store information in the form of probability distributions, and how they could use these probability distributions as knowledge base to then carry out computations on some new inputs, say a cue for memory recall or visual stimulus. And so let me start with one theoretical result, which says that in principle you find lots of probability distributions encoded in also quite realistic models for networks of neurons in the brain. So let me go through this theorem. It says that any network C of spiking neurons, you need to have some noise here in some form, for example, unreliable synaptic release of the type that I have indicated, converges from any initial state to unique stationary distribution of network states Y. And so also if the system gets at the same time a certain input X, this is now then a condition distribution of network states conditioned on the current input X then. And for simplicity, you can assume in the simplest case, you assume all the inputs consist of certain constant Poisson firing rates then. But this theorem also holds for somewhat more general conditions when this X is generated by some Markov process. Now this tells us something that in principle it's not so difficult for a network of spiking neurons to embody probability distributions. Simply they automatically have no distribution of network states if it has some noise in there. So it's essential. Obviously, if you would have a deterministic model, then you wouldn't have any interesting distribution of network states there. And so the question is then, could this distribution of network states contain information there? And could it be used for computation there? Before I go into this, let me only mention that this here I mentioned here the notion of network state, and you can view this in the same way as in this experiment of Berkes et al., that you simply record which neuron fires or doesn't fire in some short time window. But the other notions of network states, I will come to this in a moment. So this is not very sensitive to this definition then. It's also surprisingly not sensitive to the exact details of the model. There are many different neuron models, and as you may know, there are not just two types of neurons in the cortex. There are dozens of different neuron types, which they have all different nonlinearities, different temporal firing patterns. And in principle, one can put all these nonlinear aspects in there, and also synaptic dynamics is nonlinear and changes on many timescales there. And this theorem still holds about it. So it's one of relatively few mathematical results, actually, which have this generality that they're not tied to really strongly simplified linear neuron models there. And so, therefore, now I want to examine a question whether this stationary distribution of network states which exist there could be possibly a way to open for us theoreticians the door to understanding how to compute also with probability distributions. And anybody who's interested in this, in principle, there's it's a construction lemma. It's a quite general result about which occurs in several variations in the literature, that if you start with two different probability distributions of initial states and you let in each of these two scenarios the stochastic network evolve, then afterwards the distributions have moved a little bit closer together there. And so this is the core in the end for this convergence theorem then. So this is now cartoon to indicate different notions of network states that one can use. And so this is the one like in this experiment of Berkes et al., a simple one, and typically neuroscientists like these types of simple network states. If one looks at the mathematics of this underlying theory, one actually has to take much longer time windows and simply also record the actual time when each neuron fires during this longer time window, because it's essential for this theory that you can analyze this system as a Markovian system there. And so therefore you need a notion of Markov state, which means that you want to have that this time window has to be long enough so that if you know what happens here, you can predict, well, say the other way, if you want to predict what happens here, it doesn't help you to know anything about the earlier past if you just know everything in this window. This gives you already all the information. So this becomes conditionally independent on the past given this here. And so therefore, just conceptually and for the mathematical analysis, we need to go to these Markovian states. But then once you have proved a stationary distribution over these long Markovian states, automatically this implies also stationary distribution of the simple states or many other notions of state, which also you can think of then. So now let me address the question, assuming that the brain really uses this capability to store probability distributions, can it use it in any meaningful way? Then obviously now we are very far from this attractor computational model, and the question is there a new computation model on the horizon? And in principle now, this model of probabilistic inference has been proposed by many neuroscientists and cognitive scientists for a long time then, so it's nothing so new. I think it's only the perspective how we propose that this probabilistic inference could be carried out is changing somewhat in the light of this theoretical analysis. So most of the work in computational neuroscience, where one tries to understand how probabilistic inference can be carried out by a network of spiking neurons, focused on one family of algorithms. And so this is typically called belief propagation or message passing. And this is in the end a deterministic, a clever distributed calculation there. This is sometimes one forgets about this fact that it's really calculation, although you talk about message passing. And a number of clever people have proposed models how in principle networks of spike neurons could carry this out. One characteristic feature of these types of proposals is that a noisy network is bad from the perspective of this type of probabilistic inference there, because it messes up your calculation. Now, people in machine learning have proposed, actually very close by in Toronto, Redford Neal was one of the pioneers of this proposition, that there's a completely different way of carrying out probabilistic inference. And so this is simply through sampling. And the strategy is completely different. So you don't care about having an analytical representation of this distribution P for which you want to carry out probabilistic inference. You want to have a realization, or as one often in neuroscience or biology says, an embodiment of this distribution through a real stochastic system. And this stochastic system is in the abstract theory of sampling any Markov chain then. And so therefore one calls this type of sampling MCMC sampling, so Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling. And you just have to make sure that you have in your hand a Markov chain which has this probability distribution P for which you want to carry out inference as its stationary distribution, which simply means here then, so that if T is the transition probability operator of this Markov chain, then if you start out with certain probabilities in the state y prime, then it moves you then altogether to the probability of landing in y then, and you have here the same P as on this side. So this is this fixed point property of the stationary distribution in this abstract case then. And now when you want to use a Markov chain for carrying out probabilistic inference, you have to do it in the following way. You just start it somewhere then, and then you have to let it run for a while. And after a while, you can extract states from it, like these y's then, which are generated from this. And after a while, you can assume that these states are drawn then from a close approximation of the stationary distribution here then. And so then one calls this time until this generation of these states has approximated the stationary distribution, usually convergence time or burn-in time in machine learning. And after this convergence time, you can view now this Markov chain as an embodiment of this P then. And then you can ask questions about P by simply looking at the samples. So this is, in this cartoon, you see here's, a bimodal distribution here is plotted here. And these white balls are now samples drawn from this. And we see now, if you take the colors away, you have already here some approximation of this distribution in your hand simply by now observing the samples. So this is really the process here. You replace this analytical full description by simply concrete examples drawn from this. And now we see also the obvious kind of complexity problems. You have to ask how many, for example, examples you need to have a good guess how the structure of the distribution looks like. And there's also a certain temporal process. I mentioned this convergence time. So maybe you start here, then this Markov chain moves this, maybe as the next state this one, and then it moves this one. So far it appears it's a distribution which only has one mode here then, right? And you may you let it run for a few more times, and only until it really has discovered that there's another region of high probability states. Until then, you get a better account of the structure of the probability distribution. So we see here that in principle, it's important to take a number of samples then, and it depends on the complexity of the distribution in the end of how many samples you need here. And so this obviously now is the question, what happens now if you take realistic models for cortical microcircuits? What is their convergence time then? Because if the convergence time is on the scale of many seconds or minutes, then this would obviously not be a very useful way of extracting knowledge about the probability distribution from a network. And in principle, the theory tells us it's okay then they have exponential fast conversion to the stationary distribution. But sometimes in theory, you can't trust it so much because they're very large constant factors which are so large that they don't make it a realistic estimate then. And so therefore, one has to resort to computer simulations there. And just here in a cartoon of this type of simulation. So here we just watch the joint states of 3 neurons in some network C then. And we watch now the state where all the 3 neurons fire within a certain time bin. And you see here in this trial, you have here a number of time points on this continuous axis where in the last window you had a spike of every neuron. Here in these blue parts of the time axis, you have this again, then here again, and here again. And when we again have another trial with the same initial state, you again see here a certain part of the time you are in a situation where in the past time window, every one of the 3 neurons fired here then. So the question is, does this converge to something? And does this converge, this proportion of these blue bars on this time axis, does it converge to a particular probability? And does it converge in particular also to a probability independently of the initial state? If you assume here now a different initial state, which has to be one of this long Markovian state, then things may look differently. You see here that actually with this initial state, you have a somewhat more rare occurrence at the beginning of this state where all these 3 neurons fired within one time bin here then. And so if one records now these results from carrying out many copies of these trials with this initial state and many copies of these trials with this red initial state, now you see here and plot the relative frequency or simply the integral over the blue part of the timeline or the red part of the timeline here as a curve here is a function of time while you let these trials evolve, then one sees here empirically that these converge to a certain probability, which in this case is 7% then. And in this case, one sees here, can simply observe here, the convergence is somehow taking place around this here. So this doesn't look so bad, but this was only a very small subset of a circuit. And so therefore, we started to study this a little bit more rigorously in taking a more professional model for cortical microcircuit. And there are a number of new models coming up then, but the problem is always with these new models then they provide more detail then, but also they provide more open questions because certain connection probabilities are not yet known. And so this is in some sense a relatively simple one because these were data which where only one distinguished 6 different populations of neurons, excitatory neurons and inhibitor neurons, here on layer 2, 3, on layer 4, and here on layer 5. And then in very long series of experiments, mainly in the lab of Alex Thompson in London, they recorded through dual intracellular recordings what is the probability that if you take a neuron here and a neuron here, that they are connected, and if they're connected, what is the average amplitude of the postsynaptic response there? And so here this thickness of the arrows kind of gives you an indication of the product of both the connection probability and the amplitude then. And you see here, there's quite a bit of structure. There's some strong connections, some connections don't exist here. I don't want to go further in details, but just to say in principle, and I want to simply introduce or suggest a certain methodology to start these computer models of generic cortical microcircuits. And when you let them run, you see the neurons fire here on this layer 5, on layer 4, and layer 2, 3 then. The question is whether we can now apply this abstract theoretical analysis also to these computer models and get some results out there. One should say here when we use then stochastic neural models there for simplicity, there are some standard versions of leaky integrated inferred neuron models where you take the membrane potential as something which determines the probability of emitting a spike. You don't really have a deterministic crossing of a spike threshold there. And so one sees here now the measurements for these types of simulations of these cortical microcircuit models for 4 different sizes of this model, which all now are based on the same statistical data. So from 500 neuron circuits to 5,000 neuron circuits, which was the largest one which you could simulate in our not too large cluster in Graz at the moment. And so here the plots are done in a way that one uses this so-called Gell-Mann-Rubin value, which is a standard method to analyze in MCMC sampling convergence probability. And it converges the variance between 2 different runs with 2 different initial conditions with the variance which happens in a single run with one single initial condition there. And one usually argues that when these 2 things become close, when this quotient gets here in the range of 1 here, so like in the gray zone, one usually assumes in machine learning that these have now converged, sufficiently good converged to the station distribution there. So this suggests here that for this convergence takes place here within this gray zone at a time around 200 or something millisecond there. And surprising fact is that it's almost the same analysis for all these different sizes of the circuit. So this is some phenomenon which we don't yet completely understand. It almost looks as if there's a theory behind this which says that under this way, for this way of generating these microcircuits of different sizes, you can prove that it is independent of this microcircuit size, then this would be great, because obviously we're interested in what's happening in a real cortical column where you have not a few 100,000 neurons there. And the question is whether you still have sufficiently fast convergence to the station distribution. And we do know already this depends on some network aspects, connectivity aspects. It depends on the statistics of the weights and other parameters. And the question is whether biological cortical microcircuits are constructed in such a way that this convergence takes place sufficiently fast then. So at the moment, this is just a hypothesis, and we will see in a few years when we also have more detailed models available in this Human Brain Project in Europe and also supercomputer simulations, whether this still holds true that one has fast convergence there. And then also we have to understand details of the structure of cortical microcircuits from the perspective, do they support or do they hinder fast convergence there? So it's simply a new way of looking at microcircuit structure. By the way, here also we estimated also one other potential kind of readout from such a large microcircuit, where we simply assumed that there is one spiking neuron which gets input from a fairly large subset. Here we chose random weights connections from this 500 neurons, and we saw that this converges even faster there. So this question about speed of convergence has somewhat also to do what information have downstream networks to extract from this stochastic network. In principle, this time range of a few hundred milliseconds happens to be just the time range which is proposed by neuroscientists. So there's wonderful work by Lammer and Rolf Seemer from Netherlands, already here, this from 2000, where they argued that when you record it from V1, that the difference really, whether from the top-down feedback, which tells you something important is happening about this receptive field. This is here kind of visualized in these two different scenarios here for these two different time courses of this firing rate. And you see here the difference starts to set in here after a few hundred milliseconds. So therefore, it's a common estimate that this is the time range of really probing the knowledge base of the brain, then the higher cortical area, in order then to use this information for understand the current input. So let me leave for the moment these types of empirical result and come closer to the question what computations could actually take place there. And the abstract form of a typical computation which takes place assuming the brain wants to extract knowledge from this station distribution of network state has the following form then. So here this X, remember, this was assumed to be the external input, and these values here, these variables, encode the current firing state of all the neurons in the network there. So if one assumes, for example, that this external input now contains concrete values, which could be a current sensory stimulus, but it could also be results from memory recall, or it could be current goals for a certain task then what you often want to know is values for some of these variables here, which have the property that this formula is maximized. So if you marginalize over all the other variables y here, and then you arrive here at this marginal distribution over some of these variables in which you're interested in there. Because this is typically the case, you don't want to if you think about what would be the most likely scenario, you are only interested in certain variables, certain aspects of the scenario. You're not interested in everything in your brain or in the world then, right? So therefore, typically, many imagination tasks have on an abstract computation level this flavor of this combination of marginalization, where you're not interested in some of this variable, and you combine this with what they call in probabilistic inference maximal a posteriori computation. So maximization, here now you want to find values which maximize this then. So this is somewhat more abstract. It's hopefully understandable. So let me now try to come from this very abstract formulas to something where you can relate this, I think even to the preceding talk of Professor Schechter, because we can assume, for example, that the probability distribution can in principle encode several soft and hard constraints between the random variables. So automatically, if you assume that each of these random variables y here say something about whether a neuron is firing or not firing, obviously through their synaptic connections, they have lots of dependencies then. And the evidence could be, for example, a cue for memory recall then. And therefore, when you now do a memory recall, then you can argue that what you do is you're trying to find values for these variables y here that maximize this term here, this probability there. And the same actually holds also when you want to imagine something. We heard a lot about imagining in future scenarios. Both of this memory recall and imagination are exactly of the same form mathematically of this MAP inference then. So therefore, it's pretty easy to characterize these types of computation tasks. But unfortunately, then when we ask how one can solve these computation tasks, one has to realize that there are no results in literature which tell you that this is in general an NP-hard problem, which means that if you use the best known algorithm, then even on a very large digital computer, you typically cannot solve them for fairly large instances of the problem then. Because here the computation time of the best known algorithm grows exponentially in the number of variables y which are here involved in here then. And so therefore it's an interesting question of whether the brain could possibly still be able to find approximations to this very hard computation problem, which allows it to use this computations for behavioral responses in sufficiently fast time then. And I think what we discovered in the last few years when we thought from this probabilistic perspective what could be the general framework for neural computation there one should think about, we started to realize in something very obvious then, when you simply view the stochastic dynamics of a circuit C in the following form, then each neuron is embedded in this network through synaptic connections and many nonlinear dynamics. It's related to other neurons then, but one can view this also simply as a local constraint on the activity of this neuron there. And so therefore, when the network runs simply, it solves, whether it knows it or not, a very complex constraint satisfaction problem, because it has to obey this many local laws. Each neuron says, no, I don't want to fire, I want to fire now. And so there is it's hard often to really match all these different local constraints, and some of them you cannot satisfy at every point in time. But simply the stochastic activity of the network does provide solutions to this very complicated constraint satisfaction problem there. And so therefore, the main question is whether the brain can make use of this automatic computation capability. And it can make use of this if it can make sure that these constraints, which are automatically kind of here given through this network structure there, could also encode constraints which are valuable for solving problems which are behaviorally relevant then. So this is the key question, whether there could be a matching between these constraints of the structure and weights of a microcircuit with some constraints which one has to care about in the real world then. And so therefore also whether constraints can be learned in such a way that they have then an impact on the network dynamics. One other remark concerning computational question is in principle also that this approach of solving constraint satisfaction problem or sampling in general, they have typically this form of anytime computing algorithms, which are rather rare in computer science, but which are often demanded in neuroscience, because we can do, if we're really forced to make very fast a guess, we usually can do this. If we can think longer in a chess game, we also possibly come up with better solutions there. So this is something which is just obvious for us as humans, but for a computer it's not obvious at all, right? When you have a certain algorithm for solving a problem in computer, either the computation is finished or not. Before it's finished, you get no answer. After it's finished, you have the answer. And if you have twice the time, you don't get a better answer there, right? So there are only a few categories of algorithms which have this property of this anytime computing, that they give you basically at any time some answer, and the answer becomes better when there's more time. So I want to give you one example, which is not just a toy example or illustration for this potential computational power of cortical microcircuits if one looks at it in this way as solving constraint satisfaction problem. And so this becomes obvious if one looks a little bit more at the kind of the smaller structure of microcircuits. So according to a very nice review paper of Douglas and Martin, one can, in the first approximation, view a cortical microcircuit as being composed of a number of typical network motifs. And so each black box is here one of these network motifs, which is then simply a so-called winner-take-all circuits, where you have here a number of pyramidal cells, and they all compete for firing there. And they are subject to lateral inhibition, so they have connections in both directions to some pool of inhibitory neurons. And this lateral inhibition enforces a certain constraint that at any moment in time, typically only one of these neurons can fire there, because it prevents the other ones from firing now at the same time. So this is a common motif, and one can, in the first approximation, argue that this motif occurs both in superficial layers and in deeper layers. If one takes a closer look, there are different types of inhibitory neurons and pyramidal cells which really implement this, and probably these are, if we take a closer look, different types of winner-take-all circuits, but we have to feel out in the next few years what computation implications arise from this. But let's assume for the moment, these are all the same building blocks, not just generic winner-take-all circuits. And there are many connections between also the neurons in these different winner-take-all circuits. And if one simply now takes as one kind of construction principle that you have an interlocking of this winner-take-all circuit, that one neuron here can simultaneously part of this winner-take-all circuits and of this winner-take-all circuit, then this means that if this neuron fires, it prevents everybody from firing here, but also it prevents everybody from firing here in this other winner-take-all circuit. And so through this interlocking of winner-take-all circuits, one is able to achieve a very large number of constraints for constraint satisfaction problem. And so one of our students, Stefan Habenschuss, is a fan of Sudoku puzzles, and so he tried this out for solving Sudoku puzzles. As you know, you have here a certain field then, where some of these numbers are filled in, and in this now formulation here, this is the input x then, which is already certain constraints or evidence which are already given. And then you have to fill in digits into these empty slots in such a way that three types of constraints are satisfied everywhere. In every column, every digit has to occur exactly once. In every row, exactly once. In each of these 3x3 grids, it has to occur exactly once then. So as you see here, interlocking constraints there. And it's quite easy to match this type of constraint satisfaction problem to this circuitry of such a circuit in this little bit very strongly simplified model of a cortical microcircuit, where now each winner-take-all circuit consists of the computation for putting one of these digits into an empty slot here. So here, in this figure, you see there's yellow, bluish, and reddish empty slot there, and one sees them here is yellow and red and blue. So these are winner-take-all circuits which try to figure out which slot, which number should be filled in here into these empty slots then. But through this interlocking there, they simultaneously, they can't do this on their own to propose a number. They have to make sure that this fits together with what the other winner-take-all circuits propose then. And so therefore, each entry is here represented by an excited neuron. We took 4 excited neurons that belong simultaneously to 4 different winner-take-all circuits. So this is this interlocking of different constraints of winner-take-all circuits. And if one encodes in this way these rules of the game into the circuit, one sees that now this station distribution of this network really encodes the full rules of the Sudoku game then. So one sees here that it's relatively easy actually to program constraints into a network there, which also may have an external interpretation there. And furthermore, the way how the constraints are encoded is automatically made sure that those network states, meaning those proposed filling ins of slots, have a higher probability of occurring under the station distribution if they satisfy more of the constraints then, because the joint probability of a network state really is composed of many small local joint probabilities, which in the end simply measure how well it satisfies a certain constraint in here. And if you, in one trial run here, over about 2 seconds here, if you simply record the quality of the currently proposed solution of the network in terms of the percentage of the constraints which are satisfied, then you see it pretty fast comes up within a few hundred milliseconds to a fairly high level, and then bounces up and down. And finally here, after probably 2 seconds, it comes up now with a solution where all the constraints are satisfied here then. And when you let this network run again, you will find a somewhat different time until it finds the perfect solution there. And if you take a histogram, you find a plot which looks like this here, which tells you occasionally even you need 10 or 20 seconds, but often it's solved in a few seconds. And this happens to be actually a relatively difficult Sudoku puzzles where humans need quite some time. But I don't want to propose this as a way how the Sudoku puzzles are solved in the brain. This is simply an illustration for a non-trivial constraint satisfaction problem, and that a relatively simple circuit can solve this task then, right? And I think one can start to understand somewhat the power of this computation paradigm. And also, from a mathematical perspective, Sudoku puzzles are in the end NP-complete then if you make here this game field larger and larger. So we are already solving instances of, in the end, NP-complete problem. And I think one interesting question is how far one can carry this type of computation paradigm with networks of spiking neurons with noise for solving NP-complete problems. But before I come to the end, I want to address one other question which obviously arises now when we see that now we can construct a particular network which has a particular station distribution which encodes the rules of a particular game. The question, what is the limit? Which probability distributions can possibly be represented by networks of spiking neurons and which ones cannot then? And also among those which can be represented, the question automatically arises, can also a network of neurons in the brain learn this probability distribution then simply from examples from this distribution P? And this is a question which is actually not new. It had been studied quite a bit a few decades ago in the form of Boltzmann machine, which was a very interesting stochastic version of an artificial neural network then. It was actually here around Toronto, studied quite a bit, and it's still studied by Jeff Hinton's group. But it somewhat has fallen out of out of attention in the neuroscience community. And perhaps because of the fact that there are some structural differences between Boltzmann machines and networks of spiking neurons. A Boltzmann machine contains stochastic neurons there, but they're given output 0 or 1 then, and time is somewhat hard to interpret there in a biological setting there. Usually it's run in discrete time then, simply in a clock time then. So therefore, 1 is not the same as a spike. And I think on a more serious mathematical level, one sees that Boltzmann machines on the abstract level, these are Markov chains which are reversible, whereas networks of spiking neurons are non-reversible. And this has to do with the fact that the spike has a certain asymmetry. A neuron spikes, and then it causes postsynaptic potentials in other neurons, and you cannot reverse this process there. And so therefore, the theory has to address these aspects there. But there's one very nice feature of Boltzmann machine that you can actually describe this station distribution analytically in terms of its weights and the firing probabilities or the probabilities of outputting a 1 then. And so this is something which we are likely to lose then when we look to a network of spiking neurons. So we no longer can analytically describe this, and in the end we can probe this only through computer simulations. So before we enter into the question, how can a network of spiking neurons represent a given probability distribution, I want to restrict attention to distributions only over binary variables. In principle, one can generalize this to any discrete number of values. But when you have a spiking network, I simply now take as the code here that for a certain time window after this spike, I assume that this neuron through its firing has set the value of a certain random variable set k to the 1 then. And so therefore at this moment in time, the current values of these 3 binary variables is 1, 1, 1, because all of these 3 neurons, nu k, have recently spiked then, right? And so here the value of this is then 0, 1, 1. So this is at the moment just a conceptual convention then, simply in order to create a link between distributions over binary random variables and networks of spiking neurons. And now one can characterize that under what conditions a given distribution P can be the station distribution PC of a network of spiking neurons there. And so this is the so-called neural computability condition. And it demands that for each of these binary random variables of this distribution P, there must be some neuron whose firing probability density at time t, if it's not refractory, is of this form. So it's a quotient of this the probability that this neuron fired recently, given the current firing states of all the other neurons in the network. Or if you take a closer look, you don't need to look at all other neurons, but only the ones in the so-called Markov blanket of this variable zk then. And so this sounds like a pretty weird condition to satisfy by a network of spiking neurons. But we see in a moment that it's not so difficult to argue that in some cases this can be satisfied here. In principle, yeah, and so one constraint is here, unfortunately, that one has to use here an idealized type of spiking neurons there and of synapses there. So at the moment it's unknown, the question, when you insist on having biologically more advanced nonlinear models for neurons and synapses, what given distributions P can be really fully represented by these networks of spiking neurons there. And so in principle there are 2 branches emerging to this neural sampling theory, which means now using a network of spiking neurons to sample from a given distribution. Either the distribution have the property that it has as most second-order dependencies, and then it's actually very easy to realize this, although you have to obey a constraint that this network has similar structural feature as the Boltzmann machine, that all weights have to be symmetric in this case, which is something which is biologically a questionable assumption then. If you have a more complex distribution which has higher order dependencies, one can still show that one can construct networks of spiking neurons which also take care of these distributions with higher order dependencies. And so this is the last kind of result I want to illustrate quickly. So altogether, the theorem that we get from theory is that in principle every distribution over discrete variables is a stationary distribution of some networks here of spiking neurons. As I mentioned here, now there is this question to what extent this also holds for really detailed biological models. And before I sketch now what is needed to for a network of spiking neurons also to embody distributions with higher order dependencies, let me look here at a simple example and the typical way how one communicates the structure of distributions over many variables are Bayesian networks. You probably have run across them. And the idea is that for every random variable of a joint distribution, you have here one node in the graph, and then you have arrows which indicate direct causal dependencies between these random variables here. On a more mathematical characterization, this Bayesian network structure tells you that you have a certain factorization of this distribution where you have, hopefully, if it's a sparse graph, many terms where here the conditioning only has to take place for a few random variables. So it's desirable that every node in the graph has as few parents as possible then. And for example, for this particular Bayesian network, you're getting this factorization here then, right? Where you see, for example, set 3 has 2 parents there, and so therefore here you have this term, set 3, which has set 2 and set 1, but it doesn't have set 4 occurring here then. So these Bayesian networks are a way of characterizing the complexity of the dependent structure among variables in this joint distribution there. And so this happens actually to be a joint Bayesian network which had been proposed by I think, cognitive scientists long time ago, 91, because this type of Bayesian network or the underlying probability distributions become relevant when you want to understand context-dependent perception there. And so the paradigm is here the following. If you look here, at this, the transition here from this dark to this light area, you would see, if you see here this rectangular shape, then that there's really a change in reflectance here at this point. Whereas if you have here, you look at this plot, then typically you don't notice that there's a change in reflectance because you're explaining away this transition from dark to light here because it has a different shape then. And so this is the typical explaining away of certain phenomena by having side information or context about the contour of this shape, which allows you then, or suggests to you a different way of perceiving what's happening here at this transition at this point then. So therefore, there's this so-called explaining away effect, which is characteristic for probabilistic inference for distributions which have higher order dependencies. And so therefore, this is automatically an argument that if you really want to model biological processing where you do have context-dependent perception, you have to take care also of these higher order dependencies. And so to give you an idea now, when you have this type of Bayesian network, if you want to emulate this network of spiking neurons, you have here 4 modules, one for each of these random variables. And you have here, each of these modules gets inputs from a number of the other modules, which is simply in the mathematical terms, it's the Markov blanket of here, say this variable Z2 then consists here, unfortunately, of all other 3 variables there. And the network of spiking neuron can realize this neural computability condition if you here put the sufficient structure into this pre-processing here. And fortunately, it's not a complicated structure because these winner-take-all circuits that we have seen already are in principle sufficient for this pre-processing, because basically this pre-processing has to recognize what is the current firing pattern of these other neurons which represent the current state or guesses for other variables there. And so therefore, winner-take-all circuits are quite good in detecting, so learning such patterns, input patterns there. And so therefore one can not only prove that this, with winner-take-all circuits, you can realize this required pre-processing in order to satisfy this neural computability condition, but in principle also this pre-processing can be learned there. And so this comes on the basis of learning theory for winner-take-all circuits, which goes back actually to very nice old results for artificial neural networks. Competitive Hebbian learning was shown to be a very powerful learning tool. And in more recent years, it has been shown also that for network of spiking neurons, the same phenomena take place, and one can relate this even to expectation maximization, which is now a very kind of powerful tool for unsupervised learning in general learning theory then. So therefore, there is some hope that we can understand complex cortical microcircuits by first perhaps understanding the function, the computation function and learning function of certain generic motifs, namely various types of winner-take-all circuits. And so this is the beginning of a theory which tries to explain these properties of this microcircuit motif, starting with winner-take-all circuits there. And coming back to the learning, one sees that also without supervision, in principle, such a network which has this pre-processing through winner-take-all circuits can learn the right parameters for this pre-processing simply by being passively exposed to examples from variable assignments which are drawn from this target distribution P then. So this is one way how one could imagine now in this simplified manner how a network of spiking neurons could also learn to represent a given probability distribution. Although it's never being told what is the analytical formula for this distribution P, it simply gets a number of examples from P then. Yeah, one can also do this pre-processing possibly with dendritic processing. You may have heard in recent years through calcium imaging, one has learned quite a bit about these laws of this dendritic processing, and it's possible that each of them can have also almost the function of one neuron there. And so therefore, you don't need so many neurons there. So coming then to the end, we have also in computer simulation scaled this up to fairly large networks here with 20 variables, and then the pre-processing altogether has on the order of 1,000 neurons, so it becomes a pretty large network. But it turns out this one here typically converges within a few seconds in terms of the convergence of marginal distributions for single variables there. And if one simply looks now at a sample run of this network, one sees that we have colored here now just by hand that certain typical firing patterns reoccur a number of times here, like the red one and the blue one. And so this is simply now this process when this neural implementation of the Bayesian network homes into its stationary distribution then, and then the stationary distribution of network states. And this is something which neuroscientists who record for many neurons at once also report, that they find this effect of having certain network states being repeated in a certain random order there. So these are the guys who did this work. So two fabulous PhD students, Stefan Habenschuss and Sene Jonke, and one postdoc, Dejan Pekevsky. And so the summary is that these theoretical results suggest that noise in neurons and synapses and variability of brain responses and also spontaneous switching between different percepts could be not bugs but essential features of an underlying computation machinery if we are ready to view this as a machinery for stochastic neural computation. And so this is a new perspective that we are exploring at the moment to see how far this can go. And in principle, this provides access to this known powerful machinery of dealing with information stored in distribution through probabilistic inference, but now probabilistic inference through sampling. And we call this neural sampling if it's not like Boltzmann machines, which is mathematically Gibbs sampling, but if it's now done with networks of spiking neurons, we call it neural sampling. So these are non-reversible Markov chains then. Possibly one can learn also the parameters of such neural representations of given distributions P. And finally also now I showed you the Sudoku puzzle just simply as a first tryout what could be the computational power of this new world of stochastic computation. In particular, constraint satisfaction problems are very interesting and apparently solvable from this perspective. So my open questions on a larger scale is to what extent these new ideas for computation network of spiking neurons can have an impact for these also large networks of spiking neurons which are implemented in hardware, both in the US but also in Europe now also starting in this flagship project, the Human Brain Project. And then for computer science in general is obviously a burning question whether when we now in 10 years or so one has to move to where device sizes where switches are really implemented on a level very close to the molecular scale, where you automatically have noise, whether there's a ways of making a positive computational use of this noise, rather than trying to average it out in a very inefficient way then. And so this is, in some sense, I think one of the obviously big hopes, that we understand how the brain manages to compute with very unreliable low energy devices. So the brain consumes about 50 watt of energies, and a supercomputer, as you know, consumes as much energy as a part of a city then, right? And obviously the goal is not to create large neuromorphic hardware which also can carry out powerful computations with little energy. Thank you for your attention.
We have just a couple questions, or minutes rather, for questions.
So, in the first third of the talk, you had examples where in the time to convergence, the equilibrium distribution didn't seem to be very dependent on the size of the network. These were very small networks. So, what do you really know about large-scale networks being weakly, where the dependence to convergence time is weakly dependent on the size of the network? Is there anything known on that?
No, we try to construct networks where we have slow convergence there. And for example, if you construct a network which has two attractors, and stochastically, occasionally, you switch between these attractors. Then you can make the remaining time within each of them as long as you want to. Then you do have slow convergence. So in some sense, it's funny, these old computational models, if you emulate in this way, these are the ones which have the worst performance there with very slow convergence there. Whereas if you have many small weights, for example, and all the time neurons are trying to fill out new network states, these are typically the faster convergence scenarios.
So can you characterize networks which would have fast convergence, scout through?
Not yet. So this is obviously something which has to come then, both in terms of structure and weight distributions also, yeah.
So I have actually a quick question. So you've sort of highlighted one way that you can encode probability distributions, right? And that's by generating samples, right? So this is interesting because you sort of have a network of spiking neurons that implicitly encodes these probabilities, right, by their spiking. And then you mentioned also that there's this other way that people have thought about probability distributions where the actual activity of the network represents that probability distribution explicitly. So by looking at the activity in the network, you can say, oh, we've got a high probability of some particular state. So we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I was wondering, can you discuss why one of these ways of representing probability distributions would be useful in a given circumstance, and what are the sort of trade-offs, what are the benefits of one of these ways of representing?
It's a good question. So I don't think that the brain uses their one recipe, because if you take a closer look, there are certain side conditions for the sampling. Then sampling only makes sense if you have a quasi-stationary distribution of inputs there, or a Markov chain. Then, whereas if you have a rapidly changing input there, this is not a good way of representing probabilities, because you need too long to express through sampling a certain estimate then, right? And so I assume that in some cases in the brain there are other representations, and so there's one result from Mike Shedlin a few years ago in Nature where they have shown in area LRP that neurons encode through their firing rates the log probability of a certain influence of a certain stimulus on the reward probability. So we know already that there are these other more quasi-analytical representations of probabilities, but these were monkeys which had learned this task for 3 months or something. It was a complicated task then. And so therefore there's obviously the question, it could be that after a while for this very well-rehearsed task, then there are different representations are then expressed in the brain then.
So just as a reminder, we're going to start up at 1:30 again. So we sort of lost 15 minutes for lunch. But so Paul Grunfer is going to be talking about the neurobiology of decision this afternoon. And I hope you all come back. And let's thank our morning speakers.